you can do the quick survey with the QR code, which is mainly just to help me to judge what the background of the audience is, so that I can go quickly past some slides if there's less interest. And let me just see if I can find the relevant thing to go to. Yeah. Sorry, I just have to switch my screen. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know that we have many people filling it in, but you should be, and if I present that. Okay, well, only 2 people have filled in the survey, so that defeats the thing. Well, okay, well, you're going to have to listen to all the slides then. I'm just going to have to make some assumptions that the audience is somewhat knowledgeable about the topic. But yeah, as Mark said, if I just go on to the next slide. I'm actually currently deputy chair of CRIRSCO as well as chairperson of PERC, and I'm one of the IGI, the Institute of Geologists of Ireland's representatives on PERC, and PERC representative on CRIRSCO along with Mark Burnett himself. And as people know who've attended some of my lectures before, you may see on my screen my mascot Lou, which is just to remind people that I did my geology training in Ireland. Started my career there, but have now been out living and working outside Ireland for over 40 years, I think. But you can find me on LinkedIn if you probably, many of you probably already know me and where to get. And just very quick introduction on PERC, which is the Pan-European Reserves and Resources Reporting Committee, and the IOM3, under which the Mid-South falls, is a member of the of PERC, one of the founding members of PERC, in fact, and PERC is a constituent and founding member of CRIRSCO, and is responsible for developing and maintaining the PERC reporting standard. And again, the 2 relevant websites are up there if you had to find those, and there is a video on the PERC website explaining a bit more of the background. So the topics I'm going to discuss this evening, and I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. I was looking forward to meeting some people, not having done very many in-person lectures for the last while. But it's sort of why we need mineral reporting standards. Then introducing the 2 main types of mineral reporting for public reporting and what I'll refer to as non-public reporting, with the examples of the CRIRSCO-based codes and the UNFC, and then why these topics are of particular relevance to the European mining industry at the moment, and in particular the reference to UNFC in the European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act, which is bringing the UNFC to the attention of a lot of people who weren't as aware of it before, and then the CRIRSCO Template to UNFC bridging document, which I was heavily involved in preparing an update of last year. That was released in April this year. And then some summary and conclusions, sort of topics to go and think about and maybe discuss over here. So why we need mineral reporting standards, again, well, you see in the background there the Neves-Corvo mine about 10 years ago. I was in fact first involved with Neves-Corvo. Oh, wait, someone's saying they don't have audio. Okay. Hopefully most people do. But anyway, that's the Neves-Corvo mine in southern Portugal 10 years ago. But I was first went to Neves-Corvo 40 years ago and was involved in the late 80s in some of the initial resource estimates at the point when the mine was being constructed. At that time, the mine life was 30 years, and now the mine is still going and sort of expanding deeper more than 30 years later. So, obviously the mineral resource estimates are important, but also back at the start, there was a significant investment in order to get that mine developed. And that's then where we come on to the need for reporting codes and standards in terms of raising the finance to build mining projects. But just to introduce the two types that are going to, and these are just some selected sort of milestones or dates in the evolution of resource reporting codes. And I've just highlighted in pale blue what I would regard as sort of government-based systems, starting with the Russian classification system GKZ back in 1927, then the early United States Bureau of Mines and United States Geological Survey system, and then the United Nations Framework Classification. And all of these, well, the first really, the Soviet one is obviously for sort of state planning, and again, the US one, you'll notice the first version, the US one, was in the midst of the Second World War. So that was, and again, this was when the new Soviet Republic had been set up, when there was a particular interest in raw material supply to, support their development, and in this case, to support the war effort. I'm not sure why the date 1997 triggered the UNFC system, but perhaps in future we'll be adding 2022, the sort of Ukraine war and the concern over security of supply in Europe for triggering a new interest by governments. And well, in fact, it probably predates. It has been building over the last 5 to 10 years, I guess, with increased awareness that we are Europe and UK and are reliant on minerals from overseas for some of the critical industries. Then the other systems there are to do with the stock exchange reporting, which will be what I'll refer to as public reporting. And yeah, I was looking for a photograph of a stock exchange. Found this one from the Toronto Stock Exchange back in 1937. I was looking for a more recent one and then discovered that their trading floor closed in 1997. So you can no longer sort of see that type of image. I think everything's done online nowadays. So it's probably just different rooms all around the world of people sitting in front of computers. But it's just to introduce the topic of financing mining projects that, again, as I illustrate, there's a lot of money needed, and we're all aware, to find and evaluate and develop mines, and then that's commonly through equity and debt financing, and then there are laws governing the access to equity finance, which the government securities laws then are covering the selling of shares, the primary market selling shares to the public in a sort of share listing. And then trading those shares where, maybe your pension fund is buying them, or you're buying and selling shares as an individual investor. And then, again, many of you will be familiar with, some of the incidents that have, I suppose, affected the availability of mine finance, and that's why they've then had an impact on the mining regulations, development of regulations on minerals companies. And obviously the Poseidon bubble was what's prompted the formation of the JORC committee, and then the BRIEX as fraud in Indonesia prompted the development of NI 43-101. But despite those being there are still newer scandals and or newer incidents occur, and these last two are what I would refer to as sort of digital salting, where salting being the term used to, adding gold to samples, or adding a valuable mineral into the samples to make them look better than they are. Well, in these cases, these two incidents arose when someone was doing that to the digital assay data. So the assay data were being tampered in a digital form between being generated at the assay laboratory and received and used used in the company's database for mineral resource estimation. And it's kind of really interesting that this one that's only been publicized a few months ago, there was more or less exactly the same thing happened 18 years ago. So, people will always try and find a way around the codes, no matter how good, how strict you tend to be. I think the more guidance there is, and the more where people are of good practice and the sort of problems that can arise, then hopefully it does reduce the chances of those type of risks occurring. And that is really the reason why the regulators introduce codes and standards and regulations. And then this is just a sort of potted history of some of the developments from the European codes and standards on public reporting, and particularly the IMM's role. That you'll see the IMM was involved as early as 1991 with preparing definitions, then in pulling together the reporting code jointly with EFG, GSL and IGI, which went on to become the PERC reporting standard. And on the international side, as mentioned already, the JORC code arising after the Poseidon bubble, and then the NI 43101 arising after the Bre-X scandal. But in fact, there are some, this is usually the graph you'll mostly see that everyone dates everything back to the JORC code. However, I always like to go back a little bit further, and Hoover's Principles of Mining back in 1909. Herbert Hoover was a well-respected, a mining engineer who became a millionaire, I think, while he was still in his 20s, and then went on later to become the US president. But he published a book, Principles of Mining, which I think had a big influence on the mining profession back then. And in his textbook, he introduces the terms proved ore, possible ore, and prospective ore. So it's kind of interesting to think the terms that we're still using today, proved and probable, were introduced way back then by someone who went on to become US president. But going a little bit further, and this is why I'm really sorry I'm not able to be with you this evening, because back in 1902, the IMM published the IMM Council issued a directive on the use of the term ore in sight, which I think is the first instruction by a professional organization for its members to use particular terminology in a particular way. And this is an extract from the council directive at that time. Just the members, the institution, they're urged to prevent and discourage the use of the term ore in sight except as defined above. And then they say if it's not done in that way, then they consider that such ambiguity is an indication of dishonesty or incompetency. And this is a copy of the page from the book of the Transactions of Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, which refers to a subject dealt with by a paper by Mr. Kendall in 1901. Well, back in those days, the Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, and this is probably the origin of this lecture that you're at in London, is they used to have the papers that were later published in the Transactions of the Institute of Mining and Metallurgy were presented at lectures in London. And it's really interesting to look at the transactions and see the discussions that followed the presentation by Mr. Kendall on this topic, ore in sight. So it was obviously the whole issue of minerals reporting was being widely discussed even back more than 100 years ago. And well, who knows whether it'll probably still be discussing it in 100 years' time. But going on to financial market regulation, there's sort of two key principles that really the main principle is that all investors should be on an equal footing, and it should be a level playing field. People shouldn't be using insider knowledge, which is that these are two of the main forms of abuse. Insider dealing, where someone has prior knowledge of some important outcome for a company, maybe the result of a pending court case, or the results from a new drill hole, or a potential acquisition, things like that. And then also market manipulation, where the person knowingly gives out false or misleading information. And well, some of those examples of fraud are perhaps a bit more blatant sort of form of market manipulation. And then some of the key terms we use in this regard are, terms like regulations, which are the requirements for when and how investors are informed about an issuer. The issuer here is the company issuing the shares. Disclosure then is the act of releasing all the relevant information on a company that might influence an investment decision. So that would be, ongoing annual financial statements are part of the disclosure, so that investors can judge the financial health of company. And then material information is a really important one. That's any information about the company or its products that's likely to change the perceived value. So in terms of minerals companies, that might be things like an exploration discovery, or the release of the first resource estimate, or release of the results of a major study, such as a scoping study or feasibility study, or the granting of a license to operate. And then that all brings us on to CRIRSCO, which again, many of you may already know of, the Committee for Mineral Reserves International Reporting Standards. And it is composed of the 15 organizations from around the world that you see all their logos there. And you'll notice that PERC is the organization, the National Reporting Organization for Europe. That those are the members of CRIRSCO are referred to as national reporting organizations. The founding members were Europe, Canada, US, South Africa, and Australia, which were then joined shortly after that by Chile, and have since expanded. And the most recent member from October last year was the Philippines, and there are ongoing discussions with several other countries that are interested in joining. But each of those companies, so the names of the NROs that are listed down here in the right-hand column, and the region on the left, but each one of those countries has their own separate reporting code or standard, which are all aligned on some common definitions and common principles. You'll see for Europe, the PERC reporting standard. But one important point that I always like to note is, well, many of you will be aware that the JORC code is currently going through an update process, and has been for about two years. I believe it got held up by the COVID pandemic, or delayed. But you will notice that the PERC reporting standard is currently 9 years ahead of the JORC code in terms of having been really updated and released much more recently. But that it's likely that, well, the expectation is that JORC is going to jump ahead in the near future. But every time we go to meetings, we're told, well, it's a public consultation draft is coming out in the next couple of months. The last note I had was April and May, and we're now into June. So I'll believe it when I see it. But you should keep your eyes posted if you're interested in that JORC. I'm sorry, I should just refer to down here at the bottom, just to point out that in Canada, you'll see it's referenced the CIM definition standards rather than the NI 43101 legislation. That's because that legislation incorporates by reference the CIM definition standards. And then the USA, even though it has the SME guide, in fact, their regulation, which was updated in 2018, doesn't reference any of the specific CRIRSCO codes, but it does use definitions which are closely aligned. And the SME, the Society of Mining Engineers, is currently updating their documents so that it will really be more a guide to how to use or how to comply with the SK 1300 regulation. And then these are the key elements of the CRIRSCO reporting framework, that they're shared principles: transparency, materiality, and competence. They're guidelines, they're not prescriptive. And then to my mind, one of the really important things is that they're all sharing common definitions of 16 important terms, where there are really no material differences in the definitions that they use. So, and that is really very helpful for international investors and companies with mining operations in different countries around the world, in that they, there is familiarity with the terminology being used that is common. So, and then, as I mentioned, there are also some other aspects you have to take into account. And then this the classic figure 1 from the CRIRSCO template, showing the classic mineral resources on the left with the different confidence categories, mineral reserves on the right with the different confidence categories, and the modifying factors on the x-axis. So that was really those were the terms for what we would refer to as public reporting. But if we move on to what I'm referring to as non-public reporting, and this graph that's in the background comes from a study by the USGS, where they were doing an assessment of undiscovered copper resources in the Permian Kupferschiefer. That's in Poland and Germany. And they were giving here, estimates of the known contained copper. I don't know all the details of the axis down here, but you'll notice then they're doing sort of probability type estimates of how much more copper might be found, with say the dark green being something that they're 95% certain on their methodology that will be discovered, and going to something that's 50% there, and then a 5 percentile. So they're giving a range of possible estimates for the amount of undiscovered copper that might be discovered in the future. Clearly, this is something that isn't something or could be very misleading to start presenting these numbers to investors, and that would be something that would fall outside of what we would commonly fall outside of anything that could be reported under the CRIRSCO reporting codes and standards. So the non-public reporting, well, there's no formal definition of that, but it is referred to in several stock exchange regulations. And as I say, it typically be generation reports which are not intended for public dissemination. But you could say, I mean, that USGS report is available in the public domain, so it obviously was intended for public dissemination, but not the investing public, or not specifically aimed at investors. So I'd also include here estimates that are based on conceptual and theoretical studies. And then examples of those may be reports for license applications or renewals, reports to government on mineral inventory, just for many governments are trying to maintain databases of the minerals in their jurisdiction. Again, there may be reports for company and planning applications, where a company has to forecast the future in terms of what facilities they want to build, but a lot of it they may be using assumptions that they still have to confirm. And also internal reports within company used for strategic planning. And this is just to highlight a little bit what some of the differences in those that might be there. That I'll say that maybe strategic planning more sort of an inventory of what's there, and information for planning, strategic planning. For instance, if it's areas like Canada or Australia, it may be thinking of power and water and road access to remote areas where there may be good mineral potential. Again, then, the potential social effects, and again, in terms of closure planning as well. And then maybe so these type of estimates may also include material that isn't considered economic at present, but might be in the future. And again, as we saw in the example on the graph a minute ago, it might also be estimates of material that still hasn't been discovered. Whereas in investment decisions, it's usually more a specific investment opportunity, the viability of specific projects, and then the risks related to expected project outcomes. And then, those will be typically estimates related to a specific extraction scenario, an open pit mine with a particular processing method, or underground mine with, again, a different processing method. And in this case, there's usually this constraint that such material has been assessed to have prospects for economic extraction. And again, typically those occurrences will be, within an area that a company has the specific rights to explore and or exploit the project that is being discussed. So just going, this is a slightly more simplified version of the CRIRSCO Figure 1 that's taken from the PERC reporting standard. But I've just highlighted in it then the bits that aren't covered by the public reporting, which is, conceptual theoretical estimates I would put as falling totally outside the box that's shown there. But then once you start doing some exploration, you may have preliminary resource estimates. And I mean, you might have exploration targets in here as well, estimates of target size in here, maybe from some very indirect evidence. But then when we estimate mineral resources, we do an assessment as to whether those can be included in the mine plan or not. And then typically there will be some material that may be assessed as sub-economic that will have to be moved outside the box, if you like, of the mineral resource box. So there are areas here just highlighted in color, which are some of those areas that are not really covered by the CRIRSCO reporting codes. And that's where the attraction of the UNFC comes in for government organizations. And so this is the equivalent figure in the UNFC, the figure 1 from the UNFC, and it's based on a sort of three-dimensional axis, with the first axis, the vertical one, being representing environmental, social, and economic viability, or the degree of that, with the values sort of, well, they're decreasing as you go upwards, which is sort of a bit unusual here. But then the technical feasibility, again, that again is decreasing that way towards the 1. And then the degree of confidence in the estimate, the G-axis. So these are referred to as the E, F, and G-axis, and they're each assigned a numeric code, so that which was always specified in the same order, so that the box 111 will mean that it's 1 on all 3 axes, whereas again the 112 and 113 mean it's both an E1 and an F1, but that the G is varying, so that they're varying degrees the confidence in the estimate. And this, as it's evolved over time, the UNFC has taken a more project sort of based approach, which sort of incorporates some of the approaches used in the petroleum industry, where they have the petroleum resource management system. And then the boxes that are in green are what would be coded as viable projects, which in a broad sense correspond with mineral reserves in the CRIRSCO type terminology. Potentially viable would be corresponding with mineral resources, and then the prospective projects with exploration targets. So you'd see here in terms of if I go back to the last slide, oops, hang on. Yeah, if we go back to here, typically the progression in the CRIRSCO ones is you're going from exploration resources to mineral exploration results to mineral resources to mineral reserves from the top left to the bottom right. Whereas if we go here, you're going from the lowest confidence down here to the highest confidence up here. So you're going in fact the opposite direction, which is a little bit confusing. But then the other big difference with the UNFC is that although it started in minerals and initially when it was developed in 1997, so from about 1997 to 2004, there was a lot of communality with the CRIRSCO type systems, but as over time it sort of then expanded to include hydrocarbons and uranium or nuclear fuels, and now, since then it's been expanded to cover various renewable energies and so forth. So, but what is important, because of this, you can't really use the UNFC on its own. If you search online for the UNFC and the references given there, you will find that it's sort of very generalized language in it because it has to be applicable to all these sectors. So there is a separate document called the Supplementary Specifications for Minerals that again provides a lot of additional guidance where it's being applied for the minerals sector. And this is just a summary of that and just showing the viable projects are ones where environmental, social, economic viability and technical feasibility have been confirmed. And again, as I mentioned, and that those are really brought into mineral resource. Here they haven't been, so this would be really corresponding with the feasibility study. Down here, potentially viable would be scoping study or pre-feasibility study, and prospective would be sort of projects at the exploration stage. But because of this way that it's, I think partly because of the way it has evolved, the UNFC is applied in two slightly different ways in the minerals sector. Firstly, for classifying estimates of specified volume on an individual project, which is sort of more a kind of mineral inventory type of approach, where you're trying to, put everything into a database that will tell you all of the, the sum total of all the mineral assets in an area. But from 2009 onwards, as I say, partly as a result of the influence of the petroleum sector, where oil and gas companies are often buying sort of small stakes in multiple projects and multiple, offshore oil shows, so that a company like Shell or BP might have lots of minor interests in a load of different projects. So they have a much more project-based approach. And in this case, the UNFC, that's, as I showed in the earlier diagram, it provides a framework for classifying and ranking projects, and then that allows you to compare raw material projects across spectrum, particularly from exploration through to processing and recycling. So just bear in mind when I'm talking later about the Critical Raw Materials Act, it's applying not just to sort of primary exploration and extraction of in situ minerals, if you like, but it may also be reprocessing a waste material, or recycling used material like electronic waste and so forth, and well, in addition, it's sort of a geothermal energy and so forth. And this type of approach then facilitates the project classification, so you kind of rank them maybe, and also monitoring. Now, another important aspect when we come to now the practical application of the UNFC, and I think it's increasingly likely that in the coming years, those who are used to CRIRSCO systems are going to have to become aware of the need to use the UNFC in certain situations, and just this is where having an aligned system and a bridging document are important aspects. So the bridging document, it explains the relationship between the UNFC and another system, and with instructions and guidelines on how to classify estimates generated by the application of that system using the UNFC codes. And then just the aligned system is a system that's been accepted as being aligned with the UNFC, and there's a bridging document in existence that's being endorsed by the expert group on resource management. And just to illustrate the way that works, well, this is sort of, if we have a box here, the aligned system. Well, for minerals, these are three of the systems where there are bridging, are recognized as aligned systems and where bridging documents are available. The CRIRSCO template one was, well, I'll come back to them in a minute, but then that's the minerals ones. Then the oil and gas ones, then again, there are three systems regarded as aligned at the moment. And then there are potentially other systems as well, that there may be systems based on the Soviet minerals reporting system. I'm not aware that there are actual bridging documents there as yet, but certainly not posted on the UNEC's website at the moment. But then the bridging documents, well, there be, as you see here, these, I'm only naming the CRIRSCO template to UNFC one. The first version of that was generated in 2015, and it was, but as both the CRIRSCO template and the UNFC were updated in 2019, for several years we realized that was out of date, and after various attempts to sort of get things moving, in April last year, a task group was set up, and of which I was a member, a task group between CRIRSCO and the UNEC, that's the United Nations Economic Commission on Europe, which is the body responsible for the UNFC. But that was set up, and then in April this year, an updated version of the bridging document and an accompanying guidance note was issued, was finalized and released. And again, I'm just naming those. But the advantage of those is then, if you use the bridging document, you've got, say, an original, report that's been prepared under JORC or NI 43101 or the PERC reporting standard. You can use the bridging guidance in the bridging document to come up with a UNFC classification of the estimates, and this in principle would allow people to compare projects from all this different spectrum in the UNFC. But as you can imagine, if you start tracking back, well, actually you need to do quite a bit of unraveling. So really, it is better to, you still really need to stick with the underlying sector-specific approach to get the more detailed information that's required to develop and actually manage projects. But I think this is what a lot of people in government forget. They're told, oh, the UNFC can solve everything, forgetting that it's really only a way of, combining information from different sources to get a high-level view of the overall variety of projects that exist. But in practical terms, to actually implement those projects, you need to go back to the original sector-specific approaches. And then to illustrate why this has become of importance in Europe, if you're now just remembering that bridging document there, well, there were several studies, and I mean, I'd say the whole interest in critical raw materials hasn't just arisen because of the Ukraine war. There were concerns previously, and I remember back 12 years ago, when China imposed restrictions on rare earth element exports, there was a big surge of interest in looking for rare earth elements. So there have been concerns that there is reliance on particular, countries for particular metals and raw materials. And the EU has been funding several projects on this topic, and this is from 2019, so you will see UK was still in Europe at that point, and in fact, the British Geological Survey, I think, is still quite involved in these aspects, and is also, because the UNFC is actually falls under a United Nations body, that is still relevant in all those contexts. But from this is a figure taken from this report from the CRMA project, where they highlighted the fact that there was a whole diversity of national resource reporting systems in the different EU countries. Some of them had none at all specified. Others had specific national systems. Scandinavia was the ones where they had adopted CRIRSCO type approach there, and there would be some. Yeah, I think some of the. The grey ones are the ones, many of which are maybe national systems, in which many cases they were based on the former Soviet system. And then moving on to the Critical Raw Materials Act. As I say, it didn't totally appear out of the blue. There had been a lot of preceding work. There had been an action plan on raw materials and so forth. But the first time the term was officially announced, or the intention to introduce an act on critical raw materials, was September 2022 in the State of the Union address. And then at the end of 2022, there was a start of public consultation up to November, and you'll see there were 258 responses. PERC was one of the organizations that submitted, and I believe the IMM perhaps as well. And then after that, then there was a period of they were considering the results of the public consultation. Then they published the proposed regulation, and there was further feedback period. And again, you'll see there were 310 responses. And then following that, from the end of last year to early this year, there were revisions and consultations between the different bodies. But just to point out that this is the Act is a regulation, which means it's applicable to all the member countries, whereas a directive, it's up to the member countries of the EU to implement the Act themselves in national legislation. So really this Act, one of the things it's doing is imposing requirements on the member state governments to supply certain information to the European Commission, so the European Commission can sort of monitor the overall situation with respect to critical raw materials. And if you're trying to find this document, the reference to remember if you want to search online is 2024/1252. But I'll make the slides, a PDF version of these slides, available via the PERC website after the talk, so you will be able to get the slides with the links that I have in them. But then these are the key elements of the Critical Raw Materials Act. That there already was a list of critical raw materials, but there's an updated list there, a total of 34 of those. And then there's a subset of the critical raw materials which are considered strategic. So these would be where there are supply concerns for particular industries that are considered important, and then strategic projects and strategic partnerships. And there's strategic partnerships with, I think, about 10 countries having been set up already, and those include Canada back in 2021, Chile, I think, from last year, and at the end of May, there was a strategic partnership on raw materials with Australia. So, there's kind of links happening with a lot of the other countries that are CRIRSCO members. And then there were these targets had been set. And I'm not going to go through all those in detail, but just realize, it's reducing, diversifying the supply and trying to produce more homegrown supply and trying to recycle and reuse more. And there's useful just to promote. Well, it's obviously tailored on Ireland, but the Institute of Geologists Ireland has produced a useful fact sheet just on that. And the next slide, this one comes from the IGI fact sheet, just to highlight, what those are in terms of the periodic table, with the purple ones being the ones which are both critical and strategic. And you'll notice includes the rare earth elements, the platinum group metals. But what I find of interest is that a couple of these, like germanium and gallium, are in there, but those rarely occur on their own, and typically would be product produced from the slimes in refinery after refining zinc concentrate. So they're all as straightforward as it looks, and that I'll touch on as some of the challenges later. But obviously the ones cobalt, nickel, copper, you probably already be aware of, and then many of those being the battery metals that are there, and then lithium as well as the battery metals. But then how does this then, connecting this to the UNFC, we have the UNFC is requirement in building up national and transnational mineral information databases to harmonize information, and then for project assessment and monitoring. And there's the specific regulations are one for a promoter for a project that wants to be recognized as a strategic project, and that typically is in the sort of assessment and monitoring, and then the information to be provided by member states, which refer to existing mineral occurrences and the results of national mineral exploration programs, existing mineral projects, and extractive waste facilities which may contain critical raw materials. And then just the strategic projects, which is the one where mineral companies are most likely to get involved with. This is the relevant article, and again, you can find the original legal text on the relevant European website. But you'll see here, item B here is a classification of the project according to that. But looking at the other elements, a lot of those are information that we would have in a technical study report, that the timetable for implementation, and plans for public information, business plan for the financial viability, job creation, and so forth. But an important one that's also lurking in the Act is Article 7(2) says by November this year, the Commission shall adopt an implementing Act where there'll be a single template to provide that information. Now, that's something I'm very unclear as to exactly what it is, whether it'll just be a simple spreadsheet that you have to fill in, or whether they'll go for something like the, format of an NI 43-101 technical report or whatever. But it's all a little bit, I keep trying to find out who exactly is working on that, and but to date, there hasn't really been any consultation on that I'm aware of with the minerals sector. So then moving to the scenario where you might be working for someone who has a strategic project and you wish to try and get it promoted. The advantages of being recognized as a strategic project is that there may be access to, or the Commission is going to encourage member states to have streamlined permitting processes for strategic projects to hopefully shorten the timeline, but I think they may not be as aware of the time it can take to do environmental and social impact studies and so forth. And the second one is trying to facilitate access to finance. I think a lot of people says it means it'll guarantee access to finance, but it's more that it will be flag these ones up as being suitable for investment by institutions or organizations that are interested. But in April this year, this was one of the documents that was published, the joint CRIRSCO UNEC publication, which was a guidance note on the use of the bridging document between the CRIRSCO template and UNFC. Because the bridging document itself is a fairly short document, which is an official UN document that, is not necessarily that helpful to someone who's wishing to put it to practical use. And this is the content of the guidance note, where if you're looking for that, then the really important section is section 5 of that, mapping the CRIRSCO template to the UNFC categories. And when you get the slides, I have the relevant references to all these documents as some additional information. But this then is that key document, so that if you have, for instance, a feasibility study with mineral reserves, that would be obviously regarded as a viable project and would go to E1, F1, G1 or G2, because you can't have, the inferred category as what would correspond with a G3. A pre-feasibility study, though, this is when the 2015 version didn't make this distinction, but when we were preparing this, we realized, well, if something is a pre-feasibility study, by definition, it's not yet considered viable. So we had to make a subdivision here. And then secondly, if you're trying to use the results of this mapping to develop mineral inventory databases, you need to avoid double counting materials, so that you would then, in that instance, need mineral resources exclusive of mineral reserves if they were corresponding to mineral reserves that were published at the same time. And you'll see down here, exploration target would go to E3, F3, G4. But there's much more detail, and in the guidance document, you'll find a table which maps each of the axes and gives the explanation of the category in the UNFC terminology and a corresponding explanation in CRIRSCO type terminology. And then just to say how one of the initiatives PERC is taking in trying to, if you like, get ahead of the game and provide competent persons with some guidance on how you might go about all meeting these requirements, and in a way preparing for the future, where we may, particularly in the European context, be sort of made to think more about reporting to governments and some of these aspects of non-public reporting. We recently released the PERC Mineral Project Evaluation Report, and the idea is that is a sort of a framework for, or template for a report that can be, gradually built up as a project evolves. It shows how to align it with the criteria in the PERC reporting standard, in particular the Table 1 checklist of assessment criteria, but then it also includes a section on the UNFC, mapping to the UNFC, so that you could take the information from this and then generate the UNFC coding if you were wishing to have, an application for a strategic project. But you might also be able to use the information in here if you're preparing regulatory permits, and also, not as well as for extracts to prepare a competent persons report. And some people are confusing this, I think, when we released it initially, with that it is a template for a competent persons report, but it's actually more than just a template for a competent persons report. It's the additional information that you might be compiling, and in reality, the competent persons report should really be more of a technical summary. And if you like, in the SK 1300 regulation, they talk of a technical report summary, which again could come from this. And just to wind up and conclude, sorry, as usual, I probably talk longer than I should, but I've just given a background on mineral reporting systems and the two different types of them: the state mineral information and stock markets and investors, some of the important common elements, and then the CRIRSCO template to UNFC relationship. And the important thing here to realize is that they are complementary systems designed for different purposes, but with the bridging document, you can facilitate their use together. And it is recognized in the bridging document and the guidance note that they are considered complementary systems. And I think if you hear people talking about UNFC, please don't let them get the misunderstanding that it's an alternative to the CRIRSCO type systems. It's explain that it's a complementary to the CRIRSCO type systems, and there is a bridging document that explains how to use the two together. And just to sort of round off with some of the future challenges, well, I think neither system really properly incorporates the time element. That if you were thinking of policy planners in Europe trying to think of, well, in 10 years' time, how much rare earth supply will we have in Europe or even around the world, you'd have to do a much more detailed analysis of all projects and put in realistic expectations of how long the permitting would take rather than the optimistic one that most people put in reports. And then it's estimate the final product quantities, because a lot of the times we're estimating mineral resources as the in situ material. Even mineral reserves are estimated usually as material delivered to a process plant. But in the heel hunt, what's really of interest is what goes out to the market that the industries that require these materials can use. And again, this refers like the reference point of estimation for mineral resources would be in situ, and for mineral reserves, as I say, typically the delivery to process plant. But you might want to then apply, if you wanted to estimate product quantities, apply recovery factors during mining and processing. And then, as I touched on there with some of the strategic raw materials such as gallium and germanium, those may be byproducts or even downstream products that we never actually generate or typically don't generate any mineral resource estimate anyway. So it may be, should we be thinking of within the CRIRSCO community of, reporting on the content of concentrates leaving a mine site and maybe assisting smelters and so forth in their reporting. And then obviously overlaying everything, I've only touched on the mineral reporting side of the Critical Raw Materials Act, but as I mentioned, it's talking a streamlined permitting. It includes stuff on life cycle assessment, and elsewhere there's sort of carbon border tax adjustment mechanisms coming in, all of which have, there's a lot of idealism behind all of this, but the practical application of those, has risk putting a lot of extra burden on industry and also maybe not really achieving its purpose too. But those are, things that we're going to have to be looking at increasingly. And just to highlight some of what PERC is doing at the moment, we're doing a lot of training and outreach. I mean, this talk would cover one of those, but particularly on using the CRIRSCO template in UNFC. And again, that we have done a few webinars on this and can certainly organize if people wanted training courses and so forth on those, we can organize those. We're obviously promoting, we'd much prefer the PERC reporting standard to be, the reporting standard that people would go to for projects or companies in Europe. But unfortunately, the investment community, all they've ever heard of is JORC and 43101. However, I would point out that you can actually generate NI 43101 technical reports using the PERC reporting standards, subject to having the right qualified person. But it is a recognized foreign code under NI 43101 legislation. And then we have some other initiatives, let's say, we've just released the Mineral Project Evaluation Report template at the end, 20th of May, I think it was. And we're working on a sort of integrated approach to mineral assessment, which would be trying to, provide a framework that covers both the public and non-public reporting, rather than seeing non-public reporting as something that's never mentioned in the CRIRSCO community. And again, importantly, also trying to communicate with legislators and regulators. And what I found working on the task group on updating CRIRSCO Template to UNFC bridging document is that actually when you sit down and talk with government geologists, you know, they're very much on the same wavelength of what we are doing in CRIRSCO, and they, you know, well, it may vary from government to government, but in the case of Finland and the British Geological Survey, you know, I think they see their work as more doing, you know, trying to collate early stage information, but they realize that they get their most reliable information from reports that have been prepared in line with one of the CRIRSCO reporting codes and standards. And yeah, just as I say, that when you get these, there are a couple of videos and there are a couple of articles and the references to UNFC, UNECE. So I'll also, I think that's the idea. Oops. Yeah. So I don't know whether I should. Yeah, I can. Oh yeah. Well, we've had a bit more. Okay. Thanks. There's a few more people have responded here on that, but I think I will stop sharing my screen at this point, and we, yeah, or unless people want me to go back to a particular slide.